Samuel Sharpe was born in Ontario, the son of Irish immigrants, on March 13, 1873. With an interest in the military, a young Samuel Sharpe joined the 34th Ontario Regiment at the age of 16, and he would remain with the regiment, rising to the rank of major. In 1908, he was elected to the House of Commons, representing the Conservative Party. In 1911, he was re-elected. After the 1911 election, Sir Robert Borden, the Prime Minister at the time, considered appointing Samuel Sharpe as the Minister of Militia and Defence, but in the end he chose Sam Hughes. Sharpe and Hughes were not friendly to each other before or after 1911. They often clashed over militia policy, and Sharpe found Hughes to be too abrasive in his personal style. When the First World War broke out, Sharpe was passed over for a command position despite his experience and was not part of the first contingent that went overseas in 1914. One reason for this was the open dislike between Hughes and Sharpe, and since Hughes essentially controlled the military at that point, he prevented Sharpe from serving. Finally, in November 1915, Hughes authorized Sharpe to raise a battalion of troops from Ontario County, specifically his hometown of Uxbridge. This led to the formation of the 116th Battalion, with several members personally recruited by Sharpe himself. Sharpe was promoted to lieutenant colonel and made commanding officer of the regiment. The recruiting campaign was incredibly successful, recruiting 700 men in only 3 weeks. Using his political connections, Sharpe ensured that the battalion was not dispersed into other existing units and remained as one fighting force. On July 24, 1916, the unit sailed for England, arriving in Liverpool the next week, and they spent the next few months training in England. In February 1917, the unit was sent to France to begin training for the war. Sharpe remained as the commander of the battalion, including at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Prior to a raid at Vimy Ridge near Avignon, Sharpe wanted to ensure that his men were ready. As a result, he went out the night before into no man's land in the dark and laid strips of white tape to mark the breaches in the German wire. In the raid, the regiment suffered 25 casualties. Sharpe's friend, Lieutenant Tom Hutchinson, died from his wounds that he received in the raid. For Sharpe, the loss of his friend impacted him badly, but nonetheless, it was a success. On August 22nd at Hill 70, his regiment relieved the 27th Battalion in a frontline trench. For 5 days, his men fought in the battle. In that time, 11 died and 51 were wounded. Then, in October and November, his regiment was at the Battle of Passchendaele, where they suffered 36 casualties. Of the 1,145 men that joined the 116th Battalion, 160 remained on active service at the end of the war. As Sharpe led his battalion into battle, he began to struggle with the impact of his military service. In December 1917, he returned to England and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order by King George V at Buckingham Palace. That same month, he was re-elected to the House of Commons despite being on the front lines of France. But soon after, he was hospitalized in what was called general debility. In May 1918, Sharpe returned to Canada on convalescent leave and was hospitalized at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal for what was called nervous shock, but what we would term as PTSD today. In Montreal, it was said his condition had improved and he had taken a drive through the city at one point. He did announce his resignation from Parliament, feeling he could not continue in that role. Then, on May 25, 1918, Sharpe jumped out of a hospital window to his death. The funeral for Sharpe was the largest in the history of Uxbridge, and the procession was a mile long and included friends and colleagues and the survivor members of his battalion. Despite the size of the funeral, only 2 members of the government, Hugh Guthrie and H.M. Mowat, attended. Due to the stigma around mental illness and suicide, Sharpe was mostly forgotten for the next century. In 1924, a statue was dedicated at Parliament to Lieutenant Colonel George Baker, the only other MP to have died during the First World War. Sharpe wasn't even mentioned. In 2014, MP Aaron O'Toole and Senator Romeo Dallaire inaugurated the Lieutenant Colonel Sam Sharpe Veterans Mental Health Breakfast to raise awareness about mental health issues among veterans and recognize those who had sought help for their operational stress injuries to lead productive lives. On November 7, 2018, a bronze plaque in the likeness of Sharpe was finally unveiled at the centre block of Parliament. A life-size statue of Sharpe is now on display in Uxbridge across the road from the cenotaph. In the posture of the statue, Sharpe has 1 foot off the ground. This is a traditional image of someone who died in action, and while he did not die in battle, today he is considered to have died in battle. And in his hand is a letter to Mary Walton, the wife of Thomas Walton, who died in the front lines. If you enjoy Canadian history, then check out my podcast, Canadian History X, available on all podcast platforms.